Morning, everybody, and welcome to the Social Housing Roundtable. Lovely to see so many of you with us already on this bank holiday, post-Tuesday, post-bank holiday. I don't know what you call today. It feels like a Monday and it's not. Lovely to have so many people. I'm just going through and meeting a couple of people before we start. First and foremost, welcome to anybody who is new to the Roundtable. Welcome to our community. We do these sessions every single Tuesday at 11 a.m. They are free and open to everyone to attend. My name is Matt Baird, as you can probably tell by the messages and mailers that have gone out. I'm the founder and co-host of every roundtable session. We ran 48 of these in 2023. We're looking to pass 50 this year, which is amazing. But more importantly, wouldn't be here without the support of all of you. So thank you very much for that. Day to day, I'm a recruiter, so I've been recruiting in social housing for over 11 years and recently joined a business called Spire House. We're going to be helping promote our recruitment arm just that little bit wider, as well as giving specialists who do HR and legal recruitment alongside the social housing side. So if you are looking for support, please do reach out. And I'm also co-chair of the board for Spring Housing in Birmingham, who are a supported housing charity. Recently became a registered provider after a merger with St Anne's Hostel. So delighted to be a part of that. So, as you can probably tell by all of that, I love social housing. I've been involved in one guise or another now for a fair while. And what's been amazing through the growth of this roundtable community, which started 3 years ago, is just a little platform for people to be able to come together and share best practice and ideas during the pandemic. We've now had over 750 people literally just attend this year, which is amazing. The mailing list is over 1,000 people. But most importantly, what it's done is it's given people the chance to come together and have true and authentic conversation, whether you are brand new to social housing or whether you've been involved in it for decades. So whether you are, whoever you might be, you could be a sector consultant, you could be a tenant, you could be someone who has been in a customer service centre for a week. Please know your views are welcome here, they are valid here, and we want to hear from you just as equally as anyone else. So do feel encouraged to speak up if you have got questions or thoughts. So alongside all of that, I've also done some work with the Chartered Institute of Housing mainly over the last 12 months, which have given me some incredible opportunities. I hosted CIH Bristol last year. I was involved in Brighton earlier this year. And they've sponsored 4 sessions of the Social Housing Roundtable this year, which is still kind of a bit of a pinch me moment for myself. And we've ran 3 so far. We've actually extended it to 5 because we're going to do one in November. But this is our 4th session already this year. Mainly because Megan, who I'm going to introduce in just a minute, came to me and said, Matt, are you doing one on the planning reform consultation? I was like, I hadn't planned to, but I'm guessing we are now. And that's kind of how it's come about. So I'm going to pass over to Megan and to Rachel to introduce themselves, the amazing work that the Chartered Institute of Housing do. I'm a massive advocate for the CIH. But more importantly, to kind of have the chance to really discuss some of the key themes of what the consultation is about. Now, to those who have been to the roundtable, as a final point, we normally do these for an hour. Today is an hour and a half for good reason. There's a lot of content to go through, but there is also then plenty of time for questions and thoughts and theories afterwards. So during that time where Megan and Rachel are sharing the presentation, do please feel free to put any questions you like in the chat box, thoughts, ideas. Feel free to download into there while that's going on, and then we will go to that general conversation afterwards. So Megan or Rachel, I'll pass over to one of you two first. I don't mind who'd like to start.
Thanks, Matt. Starting with me, so I'm Rachel Williamson, Head of Policy and External Affairs here at CIH. Great to see lots of you on the call, and I know lots of people will be listening or watching back as well. So I hope you find it helpful. And as Matt said, we've put an hour and a half in for this. It doesn't mean we need to use a full hour and a half, but we just didn't want to curtail the discussion if people had lots to say. And I should probably start by saying, just to manage expectations, we are not planning experts. There will be others who are better placed than us to advise on the technical details of the consultation, but we're really keen today just to talk through the high level points that we've taken away from reading it, and to reflect back some of the points we're looking to draw out, and the questions that we would love to hear some feedback from you either today or subsequently before the consultation deadline closes. So just bear that in mind. We might not be able to answer technical questions, but we'll certainly do our best to take away anything that's housing related. I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully get the presentation up running for you all to see as we talk through it. Can everyone see that now? Brilliant. But how do I get it to share through. There we go. So just a quick introduction, and Megan is in the policy team and will introduce herself a little bit when we come on to her. And these slides can be shared, excuse me, afterwards, anyone that would like to have a copy if helpful. I imagine most people are pretty familiar with Chartered Institute of Housing, or CIH for short, but I'll just give a very quick overview so you're familiar if not. To have a bit of a look at new government priorities, just to give us a bit of context before we dive into the NPPF, and then, as we've said, some time for discussion. So Megan and I, from the policy and practice team, but if you know about CIH, you'll know that there's much more we do than policy. We're the UK professional body for people working in housing, so I'm sure many of you listening, watching now or later will be CIH members. If you're not, and you work or live in social housing and are keen to find out more, do have a look. All the membership details are on our website. In the policy and practice space, we're really interested in anything and everything to do with housing. Majority of our members work in social housing, so we spend a lot of time focused on that, but we also look at issues related to private rented sector, owner, occupation, and so on. We're a fairly small team, so we can't be across everything in detail, but we do our best to get across the issues that certainly our members are most interested in. But with our Royal Charter, we also have a clear focus on public interest as well. So we do work on housing rights. So just to flag that if you weren't aware, and we produce things like the UK Housing Review, which is a fantastic set of data analysis, which comes out twice a year, the next one coming up in November. So a plug for that, or indeed October, a plug for that, because that's open to everybody if you want to take a look. We support our members as well with communities of practice, so we have network groups meeting on everything from net zero to supply and development, homelessness coming up. We meet with parliamentarians and stakeholders to try and influence and advocate for the sector. So hopefully you see us out and about in lots of different ways, and you can see that picture there with our CEO Gavin Smart alongside Kate Henderson from the National Housing Federation, and of course Angela Rayner, who's now Deputy Prime Minister, but this was a roundtable we had with her end of last year. So lots to keep us busy. Now, in terms of the new government, and I'm not sure at what point we stopped saying new government, but they still feel pretty new, I think. Labour obviously has come out strongly and quickly on housing and planning as a driver for economic growth. We're seeing lots coming out, I think even just now this morning, Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, giving a speech, and obviously we haven't had a chance to unpack that yet, but lots coming out. And indeed, Rachel Reeves, as Chancellor, her very first speech was very focused on housing and planning. So a really big framework for us to work from, but of course with all these things the devil is in the detail on how it's taken forward, where the money might be, etc. We've got a strong team of housing and planning ministers and wider set of ministers under what is now called Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, because the Levelling Up title has dropped from there. And that CIH what's it called, podium you can see there, which the Prime Minister is speaking out. This was from an event that CIH ran early in the year before Labour got into power. So really encouraging, I think, to see housing and planning front and centre, but of course lots of challenges there, and we're going to be looking at that because planning is being looked at, I think, to do quite a lot of heavy lifting in some of the reforms they're looking to introduce. So there's some work to do to understand exactly what that's going to mean for delivery. Angela Rayner then, having heard from Rachel Reeves as Chancellor, we then heard from the Deputy Prime Minister at the end of July, who set out a series of announcements, some of which is introducing change we can see already, some of which is hinting at what might be to come. And of course, this morning, we're going to be talking about changes to the National Planning Policy Framework, or NPPF for short. But they also introduced or indicated that they will be introducing reforms to Right to Buy, so a promised consultation on that. And the reason I mention that is because, of course, it's important to understand if we're going to be looking at boosting supply, part of which is through planning reform, we also need to look at how we turn the tap off, so to speak, on that loss that we are currently facing in social housing as homes are sold through Right to Buy at a quicker rate than new ones can be built. We also heard confirmation of Awaab's law for the social housing sector, but also extending into private, and indication of a long-term housing strategy to come by the end of the year, which CIH and many other partners, of course, had been calling for. And we're working behind the scenes to obviously try to influence what's in that. We produced for the CIH something called Homes at the Heart strategy last year, and a 10-point plan, which hopefully many people have seen. And a lot of the changes that we're seeing being introduced now or hinted at reflect some of the calls to action that we had made. So we're encouraged by that, but of course there's a lot of detail to work through, but encouraging to see indications of greater financial certainty through what sounds like a 10-year rent settlement to come at the budget at the end of October, and clarification of future funding for the Affordable Homes Programme, as well as some flex around how it's working for now. So if you're a member, do have a look if you haven't seen already, the What You Need to Know briefing that we produce, which is on the website, and there's a link in the slide there. Perhaps we can pop it into the chat. As Megan will come on to the NPPF, we've also got briefing guides for that. So it's all moving at speed, and anything else that happens after today's session, of course, we'll continue to update members on in all the usual ways and through our What You Need to Know briefings. But I'm going to hand over to Megan now to talk you through the headlines from the NPPF.
Thanks very much, Rachel. Yep, hopefully you can all hear me. Let me know if I disappear from Wi-Fi issues. But yeah, it's lovely to be back on the roundtable. So thank you, Matt, for having us. I'm Megan Hinch. I'm Policy and Practice Officer at CIH. So I'm leading on the NPPF consultation with a lot of support from the team. If you've read it, you know it's a big one. 106 questions in it. So we won't be able to cover everything today. We're going to cover as much as we can. Like Rachel said, a lot is in our What You Need to Know guide. If you're a member, we're going to touch on some key points. But yeah, we'd really welcome to hear your thoughts on it. So what you need to know is that there's a lot of changes that have been reversed from the December 2023 version of the National Planning Policy Framework. So there's a bit of a merry-go-round, things keep moving. So the one we're talking about today is the new one. This is subject to consultation, and that closes on the 24th of September, so it's quite quick. So we're really keen to hear from you and anyone listening or watching back. If you want to feed in your views, there's some information on the slides on how to get in touch with us, or you can just email us. Obviously, it's quite quick turnaround, so get in touch as soon as you can. We'd love to hear from you. The government has indicated that it plans to publish a final NPPF by the end of the year. So there is quite an emphasis on planning becoming the key point in pushing it forward quite quickly. Like Rachel said, planning's doing a lot of the heavy lifting. We're looking forward to seeing kind of what else comes out and what else is will support the sector. But at the moment, it's planning as part of the agenda for growth. So we'll probably see finalised versions of this by the end of the year. Again, all the proposals are online on the government website, so have a look at that for more details. Next slide, please, Rachel. Sorry, I feel like I'm doing a government presentation here. Yeah, like I said, we have a What You Need to Know guide for members, which you can access, which kind of summarises all of the NPPF and the key points. Like I said, we'll go through some of them today, but if you're a member, it's all on our website or on our socials, you can have a look. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of key points, these are probably some of the biggest. They might impact local authorities more than housing associations and others, but it's worth listening because it will probably change kind of the housing delivery in your area you're operating. So it's worth paying attention to this. So one of the big changes is that the new standard method is compulsory for all local authorities to assess housing need. You might not think that matters too much if you're not doing on housing need, but it really will impact your work. So it aims to provide clarity and certainty, more balanced distribution across the country, and to meet the ambition of 1.5 million homes over 5 years. I'll carry on.
Sorry about that. I'll get that muted.
No worries, thanks, Matt. So to give a very basic understanding of it, this means that you have a baseline percentage of your existing housing stock times by an affordability multiplier, which is a bit stronger. That then gives you how much your housing need is, and that gives you your new housing target. So this will have varying impacts across the country. So for example, this consultation removes urban uplift, which was a policy that was used for the 20 biggest towns and cities in England, which increased their target of housing supply. That's been removed. So you might see some places have gone down a bit. So There's lots of talk in the media about London's going down, although London's is still higher than their current delivery, so don't worry, everyone's still got very ambitious targets. But some places like the Midlands and the North have gone up by quite a lot. There's this also, the consultation includes the 5-year land supply and 5% buffer, which basically means that you need to plan for future supply, so 5 years ahead. So basically it requires you to have a lot more housing stock, a lot of plans for housing delivery, and to release a lot more land. So your target might have gone up quite a lot in your local area, so have a look at that. Like I said, you can kind of look at all the details on the proposals on the website. So the reason for these targets, it all links into the local plans. So most local authorities will or should have a local plan, but the government are really strong on this in making sure everyone does. So there's a lot about kind of what you need to put in the local plan and how it will change. Apart from the transitional arrangements, which I'll discuss in a second, new local plans based on the new housing targets are to be submitted by December 2026. So as you can see in the quote from the proposals, they want to adopt these as quickly as possible, to have an ambition of achieving universal plan coverage and to contribute to 1.5 million homes. So there is quite a big push on having this quickly, and there are more powers for the Secretary of State to intervene if these are not in place. There are details in the consultations about local authorities who are in further stages of producing a local plan already. So that gives you a bit more flexibility on the timelines. It might have more targeted support. So where you are in that journey, have a look on there. It might be different based on what you're currently at with your plan. The consultation also notes that local authorities should not stop producing local plans to wait for these new proposals to be implemented. So don't stop everything you're doing, carry on, and then have a look at the transitional arrangements and see what works best for you. So those are the two kind of big targets, big local plans, big headlines. Next slide, please, Rachel. So brownfield and grey belt. Other big headlines, and this might impact others a bit more. So there's a sequential approach in the consultation, which has brownfield first and then grey belt, which is land released from the green belt. Brownfield first it's always been the policy, or it has been in recent years. This has not changed. There's a presumption of brownfield first, and they talk about brownfield passports. So it basically means ensuring brownfield planning permissions are acceptable in principle to speed up development. So it's leaning towards them being approved already to try and speed up that brownfield development. If your local housing target cannot be accessed from and cannot be achieved from the local plan and from the brownfield land, then you need to look at review the greenbelt land. So that means looking at the greenbelt area around your local area and reviewing if it can be counted as grey belt. This probably requires a bit of myth busting because there was a lot in the media, a lot of confusion. So luckily the consultation does define grey belt. It talks about previously development land or greenbelt land that makes a limited contribution to the 5 greenbelt purposes. That might sound a bit technical. It isn't. The greenbelt purposes, so greenbelt is not all countryside. It's not about we're going to concrete over all the countryside. If it's greenbelt land, it has to achieve these 5 purposes of unrestricted sprawl of urban areas. So that's the whole point of it, is so that urban areas don't kind of sprawl across. Prevent neighbouring towns from merging into each other, assist with the safeguarding of the countryside from encroachment, preserve the setting and special character of historic towns, and to assist in urban regeneration by prioritising brownfield land. So if there's a limited contribution to those, it means that it's not stopping urban sprawl already. It's not preserving the special character of historic towns. It's not preventing neighbouring towns from merging into one another. So if you review your green belt and there is land that qualifies for that, it can be used for development. There are golden rules that apply for this development only on grey belt. So as far as we can tell, this is not for brownfield, and it's also only for major developments on golden on grey belt, which is defined in the consultation. It might vary based on your local area, so have a look at that. So these golden rules for grey belt development, in the cases of those for housing, at least 50% needs to be affordable housing, with an appropriate proportion being for social rent subject to viability. So that's been up for a lot of discussion about kind of what appropriate proportion means, the importance of social rent and viability clauses. But 50% affordable is obviously, we're going to be very supportive of that. You also need to have necessary improvements to local or national infrastructure. So that might include new schools, GPs, transport, because they talk about well-connected communities. So you're not going to have someone that's kind of put in the middle of nowhere with no connections, which is obviously something we're worried about. And we want to make sure that the infrastructure is in place with all the housing development we need. And finally, you need to have access to public green spaces. So those are the golden rules. That's for grey belt development in total. Next slide, please. So I will cover over some of the other points in the consultation just briefly. They have brought back the duty to cooperate, which had been removed. So this encourages cross-boundary strategic planning, where local authorities need to work together to achieve housing targets and meet housing need. So if you're struggling to meet your housing target, you need to work with local areas, and you can kind of use land from each other and that sort of thing, and cooperate. Elected mayors will be able to create spatial development strategies, and if you're not in an elected mayoral area, they also want to work on see if that could be implemented elsewhere. So they're talking about a universal coverage of strategic planning, which will be strengthened in upcoming legislation. So we know the planning and infrastructure bill has been announced. We've not seen it yet, but it's likely that that will be involved in that. We want to celebrate the CIH wins. So we have the removal of the first homes policy. So we've talked a lot about how that could limit providing truly affordable and locally required tenures. We have the removal of the infrastructure levy. That was going to replace Section 106. Labour said a long time ago they wouldn't implement it, but good to have confirmation. Again, that is looking like it would lead to a reduction of truly affordable homes. We are aware there are issues with Section 106. That's a whole other topic that I won't guide in that discussion into today. But we need to make Section 106 work because we don't have a new replacement now. So that's some work we're also doing at CIH at the moment. We didn't call for this, but many in the sector did, like RTPI. So talking about the removal of the beauty in the NPPF, because it was seen as too subjective and inconsistent for development. So they talk about well-designed buildings and places, which we hope will ensure good quality housing, because we talk about that a lot. We don't want just kind of lots and lots of supply of quantity, but they're not very good quality. So that's removed, the beauty standard. Planning fees, so they are increasing planning fees because they currently don't cover the costs. There's about a £262 million shortfall currently. It did go up in December, but that still didn't cover it, so those are going up. They're consulting on two models for the localization of planning fees, so whether you have devolved decision making for local authorities to set their own fees or not. So we'd love to hear if you have any thoughts on that, on if either model is better. Also, they have some points on climate change and green energy and health inequalities in housing, which I won't go into loads of detail on, but I think the climate change talks about renewable energy development and all the like offshore and onshore wind, and health talks about reducing health inequalities and improving, not removing public health, which is specifically in the local plans. So I think that joined up working with housing and health and climate is really positive, and it shows that the government are in listening mode. So we take that as a win, I think. Next slide, please. Fab. So I don't want to talk at you too much longer. I will put all these questions in the chat, but we want to hear from you. So some key discussion questions. These are just to guide you. If you have any other points, we'd love to hear them, but I'll just go through these first. So how will the proposals impact you? Do you see any potential barriers to implementation? So for local authorities, that might mean, how has your target changed? What do you think of the formula and the standard? What's the status of your current local plan? Are you really far along? Do you need to start from scratch? Do you agree with reversing previous changes? So they've now put in the 5-year land supply, they've put in duty to cooperate, but they've removed first homes, infrastructure levy, urban uplift and beauty. So what do you think about these changes? is it helpful that it keeps changing? For the golden rules, that's for the grey belt development, what do you define as major development? So how do you think that would be useful? Do you think the golden rules would be good? We had a discussion last week about social rent and kind of what that would mean. So we'd love to hear anything that you have on the social rent side. What's the role of devolution? It's a lot about elected mayors and also the localization of planning fees. So do you think it's a good thing? Do you think it's better to have national policy? And what else is needed beyond these proposals? So we talk a lot about planning reform is not going to fix all of this in one go. It needs to come alongside things like a rent settlement, things like the Affordable Homes Programme, which will hopefully have updates from in the budget soon. Although I've not seen Keir Starmer's speech today, so you might have to tell me if that comes up at all. But yeah, so we really want to hear from you, and I'll put all these in the chat. Next slide, please. Cool. So just finally, here's how you can contact us if you want to chat about the consultation beyond this session. Policy and practice email address. We have the What You Need to Know guide if you're a member, so you can look at that, which will have a lot more detail than I've been able to go into today. And just to plug general CIH events, so we have a What Does the New Government Mean for Housing event on the 5th of September, which would really follow this quite well because they've talked a lot about planning reform. So I think housing is quite high up the agenda. So it'll be really useful to go along to that. So have a look on the CIH events page. And the Housing Community Summit. Matt was talking about these before. So we've got our big joint NHF and CIH conference in a couple of weeks, in the 9th and 10th of September in Liverpool. It's the first time we've done this. It'll be brilliant. It's bringing everyone from the sector together. You can still sign up, so have a look at the website for information on that. I hope that was useful. It was a very quick kind of whistle-stop tour through the NPPF, and like I said, it's a big consultation, so we'd love to hear any of your thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jim. I will come to you shortly. There's a few points have been raised in the chat first I'm going to come back to. Firstly, a big thank you to Megan and to Rachel for raising, I think, a really comprehensive and yet, whistle-stop tour of kind of in conjunction there of the planning reform. And as Megan mentioned, I'm really looking forward to the Housing Community Summit, despite having to see who can rock up at 9:30 on the second day, because that's when I'm going to be hosting my session. So looking forward to seeing some, hopefully not too many of you feeling too hungover, but still there and engaging. I think 9:30 in the morning will be the key one. So a few points that have come from the chat, and then like I say, I'll go to James. As you'll notice, if anybody is new to the roundtable, if you have got a point you'd like to raise, please use the raise hand function. We'd love to bring you in. Point the raise from Susan Healy. Will these quotas be affected by those authorities who do not have an up-to-date adopted local plan? There's real risk that our neighbouring planning authorities who do not have an up-to-date adopted local plan or 5-year housing needs will have housing directed to them. And this may have implications that despite my local authority having an up-to-date adopted local plan, we may have to take their housing. This makes no incentives for big cities such as Birmingham to get their local plan compliant and who want neighbouring authorities to build a substantial part of their quotas. I don't know if Megan or Rachel have any thoughts on that part that's come through.
Yeah, that's a good question. So this will be applicable for everyone. So it doesn't really matter what stage your plan is. Eventually you will need to have it updated with the new targets. I completely agree that the status of plans varies a lot across the country, and I think the consultation does acknowledge that, because like I said, it talks about transitional arrangements for those further along and those less so. Everyone will need to kind of comply with this. So if you already have an up-to-date plan, like I said, those will kind of need to go in for December 2026 with updated to the new targets. And the duty to cooperate probably means you will need to work with those who have not got an up-to-date local plan, but they do talk about targeted support in there. So it might vary based on the circumstances, but the answer is everyone will need to kind of comply with this eventually. It might just be at different stages.
Thank you very much, Megan. The next point that came through the chat was actually from Jim. So James, I'll bring you in. Please do raise your, your thoughts.
Hello, good morning. Hello, Rachel. Hi there, Megan. Hi, everyone. I'm looking at this now with the Labour government and the idea of this with the grey belt and everything. And I'm actually now the chair of our patients panel, the doctors. We've over 15,000 patients. the infrastructure is already creaking across the board, be it energy, putting in roadways, putting in, you know, mains, the utilities, gas, electric. And also, let's not forget with the biodiversity net gains, the cost that's costing developers. You know, they've got plans in place and then they're being told, well, in actual fact, you know, you've got to add more cash to this. We're not happy with these plans. What will happen in those situations? Because it sounds a great idea for the 1.5 million homes, doesn't it?
That's a really good point, James. And I think that's something we're probably asking as well. I think the importance of infrastructure alongside housing has come up a lot recently. So I run our supply and development policy group. In our last one, we talked about energy grid capacity that was already inhibiting current development, let alone future development. So I think, and we had the National Grid along to that, and they are fully aware of this. And we talk a lot about kind of this joined up thinking that needs to happen, like you need to boost the infrastructure alongside housing, alongside grid capacity. I think the golden rules do talk about infrastructure. So I hope that with the grey belt, there's an understanding that you can't just plump people in the middle of nowhere with no like access to anything. And we also, I have not mentioned this actually, the new towns. We haven't got much information on new towns in the consultation. And if you have missed that, there's a task force that's been created. We're hoping to hear some more information by the end of the year, but hopefully that might kind of understand it a bit more and how these new whole communities will be created. It's not just housing development. But I do agree with you, James. We need to kind of make sure that they join up together.
Yeah, just to add to that, so absolutely agree with what Megan said. There is reference in the consultation, and I think we would absolutely encourage people to go away and have a look at it in your own time and in more detail, because we're obviously going through a kind of pretty high level look at it this morning. But there is reference to, and the consultation stresses the importance of cross-boundary strategic planning in an infrastructure sense. So yes, that we need to build more homes. All the evidence says that we need to create more homes and tackle affordability, but it's got to be supported with infrastructure. Lots of the reason why people are understandably concerned about new homes being built in their area is because the infrastructure hasn't always followed in the way that it is needed to, and that strengthening of the existing, you know, the duty to cooperate is obviously important there. Local plans will need to look at, you know, beyond just the pure locality, the role of mayors, and I think there's a question in the chat around devolution. So there's a bit of detail to catch up on this, because there's a bit of a jigsaw, I guess, the new government is building between what get taken forward in different bills and through different consultations. So there's a lot of information coming at us all at once, and officials are definitely, and ministers, I think, very mindful of the need to get this right. So all points, as Megan says, that we'll be wanting to make in our response, but absolutely the consultation does talk about infrastructure alongside new housing development.
There's a quick question I'm going to ask before bringing in Barbara, to the point that Pamela Patton had made in the chat actually. Is there a new or clearer definition of what affordable housing now means? And I think this is potentially one of the big ones, isn't it? Is whether or not that has become any clearer, I guess.
Not in this consultation, no. I would agree that we talk a lot about affordable homes need to be truly affordable, because a lot of the time they're not. That's why often we talk about social rent homes. But I think that this is a long discussion we ended up having last week about kind of what affordable homes are. Sometimes social rent are more expensive than affordable rent. This consultation doesn't really tackle that very much, I don't think. But it is worth maybe pointing that out in the response, in your response, or we can take it away in ours, that actually we need to make sure these homes are truly affordable. But yeah, that's a good point. We can kind of mention that in our response. Thank you.
No worries at all. Barbara, so good to have you with us. Do please come in.
Hi, thank you. I've been trying to join for weeks, and somehow it's popped up lots of dates, and I shall be joining quite excited right from the offset. So thank you. It's been brilliant. Thank you. I too am chair of a patient participation group here in Minehead, Somerset, and I have to disagree with what both Megan and Rachel are saying, because you're suggesting cross-planning. So the suggestion there, but the government really needs to join the dots up and work together with infrastructure and surgeries, GPs, as we all know. You can't see a GP for 2 or 3 weeks. Healthcare is important, but it being a separate issue alongside homes, which everybody needs a home to live in, if they're working together just side by side and nobody is monitoring it. So my question is, who will be monitoring this cross planning? Or are you just expected the infrastructure to work and the new homes to work, and nobody's monitoring it?
I think that's a really good point, Barbara. And as I said at the beginning, you might not have caught our intro, but obviously
No, I didn't. Yeah, sorry.
This is a consultation led by the government. So it's not, it's not CIH proposals, it's government proposals, which we're all making sense of together. And it's really helpful to have the feedback and have the questions. And obviously some bits we might say, that's great, that's what we've been calling for. Yes, please. Other things we might be saying, well, you seem to be silent on this, you must address that. And there might be other things where it's just not quite clear. So all those points are valid. We're not suggesting, I hope it doesn't sound like we're suggesting that, it's all straightforward here and, nothing to worry about. Absolutely, there needs to be a join up. We will be making that point in our response that, housing needs to absolutely be coupled with transport infrastructure, health provision, schools, all of that. And absolutely, there's a big job to do. And this is one of the challenges for government in the way that departments are set up, because at some point you have to draw a line around what a department's responsible for. But obviously you can't in isolation say that's where housing, communities, local government stops and health starts. There's got to be a join up. And I think that's part of what the new government is just working out at the moment, these kind of cross departmental task forces, how they're going to, what metrics they're going to use to measure. The previous Labour government had a different system to the Conservative government that we've just had, and no doubt the current one or the new one will be looking at how best to manage some of that, and we'll absolutely be wanting to make that point. This is not the place where we have all the answers, and I guess that's the point to stress, that the consultation in a sense sets out a clarity of proposals to a certain extent, but then opens the door for us collectively, and individual organisations will want to put their own responses in, to also be raising questions that officials may or may not have thought of, some of which might be for another department to have to get alongside to help answer.
Thank you. And is this the best place, this round table, because we've got exposure as lay members visiting and being here today, to put our points forward so that you can take away and put?
Yeah, so please do.
Can we keep returning to this subject?
Can give us your thoughts now, and our details are here to follow up. But we would also absolutely encourage individuals and organisations to be putting their own responses in, because people will have slightly nuanced points they want to make depending on where you're coming from.
Thank you. And can I just cheekily ask, because I don't know if it's relevant or not, but I don't know if I'm a CIH member, as you were saying earlier, Megan, to look at, is it free to join?
It's not free, but it's not too expensive. It's I'll put the link in the chat, so you'd know if you were, but you can have a look at it in your own time.
Thank you so much.
Obviously, we'd love you to join if you'd like to.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you for joining us. And as I said, we do a different topic every week, but this one is definitely affiliated with the roundtable. So lovely to have you with us. I'm really glad you're here. Doug, do please come in, and then I'm going to go to some of the points in the chat.
This episode of the Social Housing Roundtable is sponsored by Alertical. Alertical helps as many people as possible feel safe, connected and informed by combining ingenious technology and award-winning human contact. Alertical's digital engagement solution helps social landlords proactively know their customers and properties by putting a portable touchscreen in every home, offering a daily property check through the optional OK Each Day service, plus repairs reporting, tenant surveys and much more. They also provide Beyond Warden Calls, an easier, simpler and lower cost wireless warden call solution with video door entry, dispersed telecare and smoke alarms. Alertical works with over 60 housing providers across the UK to enhance two-way engagement between customers and landlords. In 2022, Alertical won the Queen's Award for Enterprise and Innovation, and in 2023 won Housing Supplier of the Year. I'm delighted to have them as our sponsor of the Social Housing Roundtable throughout 2024.
Hello, can you hear me? Good. Thank you. So yeah, I've seen a bit of discussion around will shared ownership be ignored more or less by the government and their proposals through planning and funding. But with that golden rule you mentioned, Megan, of 50% affordable on grey belts, I think that's great. I'm not disagreeing with that. But what that effectively does is takes a lot of grant funding out of grey belt development, because if it was going to be lower, you could have checked grant funding to bring it up to say 50%. And by taking some grant funding out of these grey belt sites, I'd like to think it will put downward pressure on the land values. So land values not too much, so it becomes viable to provide 50%. Otherwise, these sites might not come forward. But what I think it will do, if I don't specify, well, don't do two things, you'll just get shed loads of shared ownership, single family shared ownership on Greybelt, because that's what developers will be pushing for, to get higher prices on the bid, which negates the chat I've seen about is shared ownership buggered. But I think what would be good is that if the government could fund through the new AHP social rent, even if it's part of the Section 106, to protect the amounts of Section 106, because if I'm right and we'll get as much shared ownership out of these proposals unintentionally, then it won't directly address the waiting lists.
Thanks, Doug. Yeah, really good points. And I think that it talks a lot about mixed tenure in the consultation, but I think we maybe need a bit more clarity on that. And I think I agree that we talk a lot about the need for social rent, but I do understand that they need to be viable sites. And a lot of the time that is shared ownership for people, which I completely understand. I'm just going to, on the shared ownership point, there's a consultation not by the government but the Shared Ownership Council on the Code of Good Practice for shared ownership, which closes this week. So if you want points instead of responding, just message me, but I'll put that in the chat. Which kind of it's almost responding to the government committee's report last year, which I'm sure a lot of you saw, about kind of the downfalls and the risks of shared ownership and the lack of affordability and lots of things like that. But I'm looking at that at the moment, so you can email me if you have any points on that. But I think that viability point is really important, because we talk a lot about how many homes we need, but we are not blind to the financial constraints of the sector. I lead on supply and finance policy, so I fully understand that the finances are difficult. So I think having that kind of mixed tenure and including shared ownership does make a lot of sense to make these sites viable. We just need to make sure that it also has the affordable housing that we need. That might not have answered your question, but I'm sort of agreeing with you. So.
Does that help, Doug? Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it does. It does. I mean, I've been buying additionality from developers for quite some time for shared ownership, and I know how much they don't want to sell it as rent, not just because they don't get the same price, but because for private developers there is stigma around social rent, and they don't want to increase social rent levels on their sites if they can do it for shared ownership, which they see as the same kind of person as a private buyer. And it's a misapprehension of who lives in social housing, but it's a stigma that is, I think, runs deep.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's something I knew Matt would say something, sorry. Yeah, that's definitely something we talk a lot about, is the social housing stigma, and we can't just talk about kind of actually no one wants to live no social housing, because that's not helpful. And I think that we're hoping on the social rent side that stuff like the Affordable Homes Programme might give us a bit more detail on that, and outline what the grant levels would be for it and that sort of thing, and that might help kind of understand that viability clause.
Yeah. And then the campaign Shelter are doing on social housing is awesome.
Yeah.
Like who's grown up in it, and I think that's wicked.
It's brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. I'm going to raise a few points in the chat. I'm going to go to Annie, then to Jim. So Susan said in the chat, I'm concerned there may be an unintended consequence of housing being directed as that there is no regard to protecting our pollinators and biodiversity. There is a nationally recognised corridors called B-lines to provide continuous interconnecting spaces, so our pollinators can continue to recover and flourish. However, if more buildings and infrastructure is built, could lead to serious decline of pollinators, which play an important role in our national food security. We need to protect them. Barbara's backed that up by saying infrastructure needs to be monitored, and Susan said when developers are instructed to build a percentage of social homes and affordable homes, they cannot keep amending the consent so little or none is provided. There must also be protections to stop this. There's another point on the doctor schools, hospitals, which I know we've raised previously. And Jim had mentioned there that don't forget the costs increased by local authorities on biodiversity and net gains at 10% net gain to the cost of developers. A quick question from David, and then I'm going to bring in Annie. So David has said, is there anything on recycling right to be receipts into replacement of social housing?
Sorry, Matt, can you just say that one again? Was that on right to buy?
Anything on recycling right to buy receipts into replacement of social housing?
Yes, so right to buy, we don't have all the information on the right to buy consultation yet. We're expecting that later this year, and we're expecting it probably will impact the discounts and also just kind of the eligibility. So we know a lot of people have right to buy issues in their local areas. They have talked about, again, reforming the receipts, so it's definitely worth looking at what they said on that, because they I think they are understanding that the constraints on receipts was not helpful, and using right to buy and section 106 is something they've mentioned. So definitely have a look at the full announcement, but yes, that is something they are talking about, which is really positive.
Just can I come in, Matt, as well on the biodiversity point? And we've got Matthew Scott in the team who may want to come on and say a bit more, because he's leading on our kind of sustainability element of our response. But I know, you know, part of the consultation is also government looking for thoughts from people on when further exclusions might be needed, further protection. So it's covered to a certain point, but if people feel actually, you know, it's not going far enough, there's a risk of unintended consequences. Again, this is the place to be making that point and you know, obviously backing it up with evidence. So if people have got things they'd like to send through to us through the chat or afterwards on the email that Megan's given, we can absolutely look at that as well. If you're there, Matthew, and you want to say any more, please do. But
I don't think Matthew can go on mic, but he's put some interesting stuff, so I'll pop it in the chat.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Megan. Annie, do please join us. Welcome to the roundtable.
Hi. It was just a bit of a point on the 50% in the green belt, and obviously the point that was made, sort of, you're going to need quite a lot of grant funding to get it up to the top, up to 50%. But in planning policy weighting terms, you can't give weight to additionality that's outside of the section 106. So you're going to have to provide that 50% without additionality on top, unless the additionality rules are changing where you can put that into a section 106. So that's going to be quite a big issue. And then I know that there has been debate sort of higher up within the department about whether to allow viability at all, because the sort of, it's predicated on the fact that it is going to deliver significant amounts of not just affordable housing, but social housing specifically, but there's no real clear direction of how that's going to work and what that means, which then comes back to this sort of definition of affordable housing and what is affordable, which again, we don't really have any direction in. So I think that's going to be the big problem on the 50% sites. If you do have to provide it not as additionality, as policy, then we link back to the section 106 problem, which again is a big topic for here. But if you've not got RPs that are taking on that stock, then is the policy going to deliver? So there needs to be some joined up thinking between grant funding, actual how you apply policy, and what RPs can deliver. And I think that's a really big hole in that policy at the moment.
That's really useful, Annie. Thank you for flagging that. And yeah, we'll definitely look at that additionality point and we'll take it away for our response. That's really useful. And I think, agree, the section 106, we need to look at it. I think we all know that there's issues there, but we need to make it work, because it's what we've got. And I think that yeah, I would agree, is basically what I'm saying. And we'll definitely take that away to look at, so thank you.
I think what's important is, you know, Rachel just put in there, the closing date is the 24th of September for the consultation. And a bit like when there was the qualification consultation, I know you said before, Rachel, this obviously isn't a CIH-led initiative, but this is a CIH response that can come, but it needs that collective voice behind it. So stuff like Annie's point there are really, really important to make sure it's being shared with yourself thoroughly, so it can go into that response, because that's the only way that actually the changes we need to see are actually going to happen. So a big thank you, Annie, for raising that. Jim, do please come back in.
Yeah, hi. Just interested to say, I met Clive Betts, you know, at the finance conference earlier this year. And I actually asked him, you know, when he finished speaking, about the right to buy and what he thought the Tories, the Conservatives, sorry, would be doing in that. I know, would it be, he said he couldn't say, but he figured that they'd be reviewing it. And of course, after that, the next thing is we had the election, didn't we? Now, on top of that, I kind of look at it this way. The right to buy was fine for people who were the generation, you know, who's were like 70s, 80s, who'd been in the First World War, Second World, those, you know, that kind of a generation that had worked and paid the rents, full rents, that now after they had bought, there should be a line drawn under it to say social housing is for the whole purpose of people living in it who can't afford to buy or indeed intend to buy. So that should be cut off for me. And the other thing is, what about all this land that they've used with the HS2 railway? They've knocked all this land down and cleared all that. What's happening to all that land? Why can't that be looked at and repurposed?
Okay, well, I'm happy to do my best to respond to that. I think obviously, as you say, we've got a new government now, and they did set out certain amount of kind of their planned position pre-government in the manifesto on right to buy, and then subsequently, as Megan said in her opening presentation, have talked about a consultation on right to buy to come. So we're waiting to see the detail, but certainly they've suggested they'll be looking at reviewing the discount. So that would suggest bringing them down, which would reduce the amount of social housing homes lost through the policy, but also looking at stopping the loss that we've got at the moment of new homes being built and then being lost very quickly, which obviously is no incentive to local authorities to be building new social homes, as well as looking at how receipts can be used and so on. So there's a lot to come, and we're watching it carefully. Certainly from a CIH perspective, we've called for right to buy to be suspended at least until replacement can catch up. And you probably know in other parts of the UK, it's gone altogether. Labour have said, though, that they wouldn't, and it's obviously quite a political issue, but they wouldn't abolish right to buy is their current position. So it's looking at how losses through it can be reduced, but recognising that some would see it has a role to play. But certainly the big push on increasing social housing supply would suggest, excuse me, you've got to do something to tackle the losses through right to buy. On land, I know the department, the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government has just set up a new team looking at land strategy. I think this is an issue numerous governments have been trying to grapple with, and perhaps not successfully, to look at public owned land and how that could be used better. There's a lot of land owned by MOD and NHS and so on. And you're quite right, that needs looking at kind of holistically to see how it can be best used. And new government has indicated it would look to be quite ambitious in using compulsory purchase order powers. So looking at land they own and land that could be owned, there's clearly to deliver new towns, for example, on the scale that they've indicated with the number of new homes over the next Parliament, they're going to have to look very carefully at how land is used. But I guess going back to where we started with the NPPF consultation, it's looking at how can current brownfield be used, how can we build on and develop pre-developed land and make best use of it, but obviously tying it with infrastructure, so it needs to be looked at strategically.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Annie, I'm going to bring you back in.
It was just on the right to buy point, and obviously the government have indicated they're not going to get rid of it, but this has been a problem overall, and I have pointed it out to the department before, is that typically councils only report gross completions figures, and in some local authorities that's only sort of 10-15 a year, but in other authorities like Birmingham, for example, if you knock off their LPA and their RP right to buys, they've had negative delivery for the last decade, which means they've lost more stock than they've accounted for. And that, if you're going to keep the right to buy, you need to have some reporting systems that appropriately collect that data and present it, because some councils can present a position that they've done really well, but actually they haven't. And that then feeds into things like SMARS and strategic housing assessments, which is completely divorced from the link to the standard method, which is a separate point that needs addressing. So if you are going to keep it, you need mechanisms to actually set out what the net completions have been and how that affects your housing need. Because if that isn't factored into the calculation in the first place, then the calculation isn't worth the paper it's written on.
Absolutely agree, Annie, and that's why the government has said, whilst it said 1.5 million homes over the next 5 years, which broadly would average out at 300,000 a year, actually they've said their ambition is 370,000 a year, taking into account of that net loss. Because you're quite right, under the previous government, and this is not a political point, it's just a fact, there were more social homes lost than built because of exactly that. And if you don't look at that in the big picture, then it's not a very clear picture when we're just talking in stats.
No, and then it also links to the point that you need to find, in my opinion, a better way to calculate what affordable housing need is, because even under the old standard method figures, some councils, their affordable housing need, when it's done under the old OAN method, that's actually higher than what your standard method figure is. And if on average nationally 50% of affordable housing is delivered through Section 106, from the off, that plan is never going to meet your affordable housing needs, which means it's planning for failure. So whether you've got this sort of coefficient to deliver a few more homes to affect affordability, that's not the problem. People need tenures that they can actually afford in that time, rather than waiting 5 to 10 years for prices to come down.
Yeah.
And that is a big gap again, is calculating that need within the 370.
Yeah. I think I absolutely agree, and it's something we were talking about last week in the session that Megan and I had with others who may or may not be on the call now on the social housing side, and definitions of affordable housing and social housing came through really strongly.
Yeah.
There's an opportunity here, I think, to just do a bit of a reset on other aspects that otherwise we might come a bit unstuck with.
Yeah, I have heard whispers that there is a new definition on the cards, but I don't know how true that is.
Like everything, isn't it? It's always a hope and wish, and clarity is all we're really asking for, but it's a real challenge. Thank you so much, Annie, for those points that you was raised there. I'm just going to jump to the chat while we're waiting for anyone else who'd like to dive in. So Susan Healy had said, could you consider, when you do look at Section 106, that when it is looked at something is put in place for improving infrastructure and where this can only be achieved towards the latter phases of the development site, Section 106 money should be indexed links to CPI, especially if delays are also because of highways agencies. By the time plans come to fruition, the 106 monies are insufficient to cover the cost of infrastructure upgrades. We currently have money, but because of delays with development, it's now insufficient to bring anything to fruition. And I don't think that's the first time you've heard something along those lines, unfortunately. And this is something that's come up. But again, it's like anything, isn't it? It's the reinforcing is so imperative. There was a question that's come through from Jen McWilliam. The removal of first homes, do we need to amend or relook at planning applications that are proposing first homes? What are the panel's thoughts?
So first homes is an interesting policy. I think when it was announced, I think a lot of the sector have kind of put out concerns about it. And again, I'll put a link in the chat where we've outlined those a bit more detailed. I think it doesn't, the way it's set out actually doesn't really help with truly affordable homes, and particularly in areas like to have the locally required tenures they need. So there are issues with it, and I know there are points in the chat also about kind of, well, what other affordable home ownership is there? I think it's a really good point. We can't just talk about renting. The government do talk a lot about home ownership, and I know it was in kind of their manifesto and things like that. We've not had loads of detail on it yet, but I do know that they are supportive of it. So it'd be good to see kind of what other initiatives they are most encouraging, if they're not encouraging first homes. Also, first homes, I should probably note, is not gone forever. It's just the requirement to include first homes is gone. So it doesn't have to be in the 25% anymore. So it is still an option if it works for you, but you don't have to do it, which I think was the issue, where it wasn't always helpful in all areas.
Thank you very much, Megan. Someone had asked whether Tony had asked, does this apply to housing associations as well? But I'm not sure which bit he's asking in terms of application. So I'll see if we can follow up with Tony on that. Rachel just said there, people may also wish to use the MHCLG email to seek clarification on some aspects, and that's also been shared in the chat. So many acronyms. We are such an acronym heavy sector. It's absolutely wild, isn't it? Are there any other points that anyone would like to raise or bring forward? Yes, Jim, do please come in again.
My concern to everyone, really, the sector itself, again, once again, 5% leaving, lack of surveyors, lack of qualified staff, new skills expected to come in that are yet just in research and development stages. And the fact that there is this feeling of unease within the sector as a whole, where people are so top heavy now with legislation and with various job specifications and job descriptions being changed without any greater enumeration for it. So with all that on top of everything else, you know, how really are they going to hit these targets?
I think that's another good point well made. I think, you know, one of the things we and others I know are keen to stress is that it's great to see the reforms coming through that many of us have called for. Maybe, you know, some additional clarification needed in some places and a few tweaks, but overall, from a CIH perspective, as we understand it so far, we think this is, you know, positive development. Encouraging to see some noises around additional grant funding hopefully to come through in the next budget, or probably more likely spending review. But as you say, it's not just money and it's not just policy, it's people, it's capacity, it's skills, and you can't deliver that overnight. And that's something we were again talking about in our roundtable that we held with CIH members last week, and we'll absolutely be making that point in the response. And I think, to be fair, government is very, very aware of it. And again, this is where Ministry of Housing, Communities, local government alone can't deliver on this without drawing in, education department, looking at growth of apprenticeships, encouraging people to enter the construction sector, enter the housing sector, not just enter, but stay in it. There's a huge piece of work to do there, and the pipeline of new planning inspectors coming through and planning officers. It's very, very ambitious. And money and policy alone isn't going to do it. But this is why it's important to make that point early on, so it's factored in. We have to start somewhere, but the reality is we are absolutely starting behind the curve on where we should be, which is why it's going to feel a bit painful at times, I think, because there's a lot of catch up to do.
Actually, on that, it's clear. So the obviously the budget's coming. We're waiting for it. Keir Starmer's done, well, actually, whilst during this session, he's been doing his speech from the Rose Garden. He said that the government's first budget is going to be very painful. He said that those with the broadest shoulders should bear the heaviest burden, and that there's a £22 billion societal black hole in the finances. So, as you say, that piece around affordability of all this, all great us going, well, I hope we're going to do X, Y, and Z. How we're going to afford it is a massive, massive question to come forth. So we're waiting on some more news on that. And if anything lands in the next half an hour, I'll be sure to share it as we're live. Doug, do please come in. Lovely to have you with us again. Thoughts and ideas, very, very welcome.
Hey, thank you. A kind of a general point on the whole thing. I haven't read the consultation, so apologies, I might be misguided. But I was reading recently about the new sustainability appraisal tool for planners in HAT, and it gives a sort of, I understand it gives like a £1 cost for social impact, being in terms of sustainability for new developments. I'm not a planner, but I did read in the footnotes that it doesn't cover refurbishments at all. So it sort of fails to sorry, I'm getting to a point, but it fails to give the public really good information about what is the difference between retaining structures and buildings as opposed to new build. And this is very new build focused. And I think building these 1.5 million homes, we do need to house people, but this will blow the carbon budget. And the reason why I tell that story about that appraisal tool for sustainability not covering refurbishments, and being very limited on its scope on the disposal of buildings. So, demolition, transport and disposal of buildings as well isn't covered when we look at carbon cost. Has anyone read this and got a sense that this is, deals with our embodied carbon challenge, or is it just playing to the build rhetoric that is so popular in politics? And does employ a lot of people and is good for GDP, but is gonna really, really hurt our 2050 goal and the next generation. There could be much more in here about reusing buildings and all the under occupation of the private renter sector could be put in here. It could save hundreds of thousands of homes being built.
Really good points, Doug. I think the embodied carbon and the carbon targets are really good points in this, because yes, we're talking about boosting development, but we also know there are unintended consequences of that. I think the fact that they've included climate change in the consultation and they're asking a lot of open-ended questions in it makes me think that hopefully it means that they're trying to join that up a bit more. It's not kind of really closed off. So hopefully we can kind of, we'll put that in our response. We'll talk about those links. And like we said, Matthew and our team is expert on all things these, but I think that we will definitely look at that, because I agree, we can't just kind of build and not think about the consequences of it. And I was going to say something else on something you said, but it's gone out of my head. But yeah, I think that we are fully aware that yes, we want to build more homes, but we need to look at the environmental impacts of that. And that was it. It was yes, it only focuses on new builds. I did have a conversation with someone recently that they would like if regeneration was a bit more in it, to kind of use both tools. There's a lot of financial investment needed in existing stock at the moment. We know that, with retrofit and with lots of other things. That's not mentioned in the consultation at all. I imagine they might be just kind of seeing it as separate points, because you have stuff like the Decent Home Standard, we're still waiting. So I think they're trying to separate existing and new builds. But it is a good point, so thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Doug. Gabby, I completely agreed with you. From a perception and support perspective for existing tenants, it's so depressing to see the focus on new builds where there are so many homes that need proper retrofitting to help people both through winter and summer in very expensive times. We underestimate the effects of heat in summer in homes designed to keep warmth in as well. I think it's a really interesting point. Just for bringing Annie, there's a point I was going to raise that I meant to earlier, and I appreciate normally we've run out of time now, so it's great we've got that little bit of extra. As I mentioned at the beginning, and as you both Rachel and Megan will know well, and a number of others will, for 11 years I've been recruiting in social housing. I think it's a fascinating sector where by and large, job titles are somewhat erroneous. It can mean anything and everything, but one area that they're not is in planning. And for the last 6-7 years, if I come across a planner who is actually very good, and I go out to 4 local authorities, someone will have them immediately if they're available and looking, because we are so short. Is there anything, and probably I didn't have a chance to go through all of the elements of the consultation, but is there anything in there around a shortfall of staff? And actually, whilst it's great, we might get this new stuff signed off, that there's no one to actually do the back office work because we haven't trained enough people for probably 15 years.
Really good point, Matt. I probably would just agree with you, if I'm honest. They've obviously announced the 300 new planning officers. We are aware 300 is a drop in the ocean, and it's probably, everyone keeps saying to me, so that means we're all sharing, and I think that is probably the case. Some people have suggested it might be useful to kind of have them as specialist teams that are kind of deployed where needed, rather than just like spread and shared across local authorities, which I think that might be quite useful in that duty to cooperate idea. But like Rachel touched on earlier, yes, we talk about building more homes and they're bringing that sort of policy in place, but if we don't have the skills to meet it, there's no point in us talking about it. So I think it's a big point. I don't think it's in the consultation enough personally, so we'll probably keep banging the drum on it. I know the Chartered Institute of Building talk a lot about recruiting into the construction sector and the gaps in that. So I think it's definitely something we need to keep saying. I think there's almost a danger that if they say, okay, here's all the things you asked for, go for it, and we say, actually, there's no capacity in the sector. But so it's definitely something we need to look at. And yeah, I'd agree that it's a drop in the ocean, really.
Down to who kind of, who's failed. There's always the argument of going, well, we gave you all the tools, and well, that's great, but we didn't have anybody to do it. And those kind of, that narrative is really, really difficult to try and kind of sometimes get across to a, for want of a better term, Joe Public, going, well, government have said they've done X, Y, Z, and they've just not done it. Well, that's because we haven't trained anybody, and it's not an easy thing just to pass. Annie, I'm going to bring you in. Thank you for waiting while I raised that query, which I'm sure you're probably all too familiar with yourself, judging by your own career.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time doing this sort of thing, but it was just on the sort of embodied carbon and regen points, and also on the staffing point as well. I think it's important to remember that this is just one piece of national policy. And I think a lot of the regen element will come in through the NDMPs and stuff like that. So I know that there's going to be an NDMP on affordable housing. I don't know what that's going to say. And part of the problem with the regen issue at the moment is the decamp point of while you're regenning these, whether it's social homes or whatever kind of homes it is where do you put those people? And I think this is the problem that we've got now, where we need the new build to decamp to then be able to retrofit what we've already got. So I think, yeah, it is important to remember that the national NPPF is the overarching bit of policy, which then will be underpinned by NDMPs, which will be underpinned by strategic planning and things like that. So it's not going to cover everything in totality at all.
Thank you very, very much. Really, really useful points to raise to the group. Thank you, Annie. Rachel just put in the chat, there's an opportunity to make some of these wider points also in the autumn budget spending review submission, which she shared in the group chat. The deadline for that is the 10th of September. Katie Gilmartin, 25% of local authority planners have left public sector between 2013 and 2020. That's not even including the number leaving since. We don't just need planners, we need the expertise in wider local authorities who support processing of applications particularly in light of wider policy, e.g. BNG, ecology, highways, public health, etc. And Mark has backed that up. Totally agree. 300 people won't solve the issue without more training and resources to be able to do their role well. They'll be thrown in at the deep end. Megan has said the consultation does make this point, but likely need more on the skills gap. So the point is the government recognises that to support the delivery of a modern economy, we need to establish a workforce equipped with the skills necessary for the future, ensuring the availability of a sufficient choice of post-16 education places has an important role to play in this. Jim, yes, do come back in.
Just saying, I put it in the chat, I don't know if you saw it. In the sales and marketing, where we were taught was P-poor profit promotes P-poor promotion and profits.
Yeah.
Which is what they was referring, if you don't plan for it properly, you don't have everything in place, then you're not going to get the results you're looking for, are you?
Absolutely. Rachel said the new planning and infrastructure bill to be published will also provide more of a framework again. I'm aware we've had about an hour and 10 minutes. Are there any other points people would like to raise before we go to final thoughts for Rachel and Megan, whilst we've obviously got the chance to ask two members of CIH personally their thoughts?
Matt, I'll just come in really quickly on the regen point. Sorry, I never use Zoom, can't figure out how to put my hand up. And I think it's quite easy to talk about the need to do more regen over new builds, but one of the challenges among many is the funding, right? So the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund has got about £3-point-something billion in it compared to £11-point-something billion available through the Affordable Homes Programme. So if we're looking at the scale of the challenge faced by housing associations, just in terms of doing that decarb work and bearing in mind the approach that RPs are taking to decarb work in terms of the kind of RAG rating and looking at what actually can be done, by and large it is actually just easier and cheaper to and that's not to say it's the right thing to do, but to go and just buy some land and start from scratch, and he makes a really good point about having to decant residents where we've got really dilapidated schemes that can't be retrofitted or regened around people staying in place. And I mean, I take your point, Doug, on embodied carbon, and I agree with you, but that's not strictly reflected in the current kind of working definition of the 2050 targets. They're very much focused, as you probably know, on that operational carbon point. So that's why we don't have Part Z pulling through in the building regs yet. We've got this focus on, and I think I know, Megan, you've mentioned a few times your colleagues working on the sustainability interface, but obviously that overlap with Future Home Standard, which we're still waiting to come through, but will have a really critical interface with whatever planning policy and the updates to the NPPF, right? So thinking about moving to an all-electric building regulation, the impact that that's going to need to have on things like design, roofs, or roof design orientation, all of that stuff is going to be kind of critically interfaced. So we're already working so hard to try and keep up with the operational carbon targets that beginning to think about embodied carbon, while Doug, I appreciate it's exactly the right thing to do, I think it's almost too much to bear at the moment with the broader challenges.
That's really good points, Katie. And I think, like I said, that Matthew and our team brilliant on decarb. I'm more sure if you email the policy email that's somewhere far at the chat, I'm sure he'd love to have a chat about it. And I agree that, again, it's that joined up thinking, right? It's that we can't do one of these without thinking about the other. And we are waiting for anyone who's missed it. So the Future Home Standard was a consultation that came out earlier this year. But since the election, we were kind of waiting for a lot of these. So same with our Rob's Law, same with Competency and Conduct Standard. So we're waiting on a lot of updates. So we're hoping they will kind of slowly come through, because we need confirmation on the Future Home Standard, especially when it comes to we have the targets. We need to know this information soon, and we need information on the future of the SHDF as well. So completely agree with you on that.
And I hate to say it, but we also then need to know what follows AHP, right?
Yeah.
Most of us are getting to a point where we're wrapping up we're already looking at schemes that take us beyond AHP and strategic partnership funding. So the other question is, what happens? What are the requirements of NPPF, Future Home Standard, all of these other things, and then how are we going to pay for it after?
Yeah, and actually, there's a Jen in the chat has made the same point, which I'm sure Matt was about to read out. So do you want to kind of link those, and then I'll talk about
Jen said the revival of the AHP has been mentioned a couple of times. Is there any information that can be shared about what could be discussed in the budget? Was going to be my next question, Katie. So thank you very much for raising it in advance.
Brilliant link, well done. So the answer sadly is no. I don't have any intel, and that's not even that it's I can't share with you. We just don't have any intel. Like Rachel said, the budget submissions are due soon, so I think by that point, hopefully we'll get a bit more clarity that might come out pre-budget or at the budget about the Affordable Homes Programme. We are fully aware that there are issues. I mean, the current one seems to have kind of almost run out, and then everyone is kind of drawing back on their development, waiting for the next one. We have flagged this a lot of times. I think everyone is flagging it in the sector. So I think everyone's fully aware, including the government, about the status of it. We need a confirmation on the number. We need confirmation on what that looks like. We're hoping we'll get it with the budget, but I don't have any more information. You might have seen in the media, we do have some more information on the rent settlement, which hopefully and they talk about confirming a long-term plan for housing, which is obviously something you've heard us and NHF shout about for a long time. So we're hoping we might get some more clarity, but we don't have the details yet.
Thank you very much, Katie. Kay, back to you as well, saying, picking up on Katie's point, I also feel that the allocation process isn't fit for purpose and would be a good grassroots base to start looking at the whole sector holistically. It isn't the people on a housing list for 20 plus years only. And Susan Healy said, my local authority is streamlined. Who can go onto housing waiting list is now under 400 people who will have a real prospect of getting a social home. So something maybe for another roundtable there in the future, because that sounds really, really interesting. Yes, Jim, go on, do dive in.
Regarding now with the Awab's law, and on the back of that, the way now it's being highlighted about the windows and the situation where the windows repairing need to be done now. Instead of being cyclical work, to be done as triage. And I think that's going to have another detrimental effect on providing, the various services we've got at the moment.
Thanks very much. Yeah, thank you. So are there any other points anyone would like to make on the consultation, on the planning and policy reform, on any of the NPPF, and anything else before we bring today to a close? I think in an hour and 15 minutes, we've kind of managed to exhaust questions, Rachel and Megan. So having looked through, so obviously the email address is policyandpractice@cih.org. There are obviously a number of other websites and things that I will share in the wider chat when I send this out. But Rachel and Megan, are there any final thoughts you'd like to share with everybody here today before we do wrap up?
Well, I think we just want to say, firstly, a very big thank you to everyone who's joined now or is listening back and might want to then drop us an email afterwards. Really, really helpful. A lot of the comments and questions are ones we've been discussing, but certainly some new ones. So always really, really helpful to open it up. Thank you for making the time and contributing. And I guess it just shows, or it's a reminder, isn't it, of what we know already, which is that, there's a danger that planning reform is a thing that governments of all ilks go to, is the thing that's the answer to all the problems. And as I think it's shown this morning, it absolutely can't be. And there's so many issues that we've just started to unpack that we'll be obviously responding to on more thoroughly. But just a reminder, I suppose, to try and end on a more optimistic note, because we've focused on a lot of the challenges, that the government has committed to a long-term housing strategy, and we and others will obviously be holding its feet to the fire on making sure that is a meaningful long-term housing strategy. I think we've kind of, there's been lots of shoots off, haven't there, from talking about NPPF to all the other things that need to be looked at for this to be looked at holistically in a meaningful way if we're going to start to shift the dial. And that's our job now, I suppose, over the coming months, with the opportunities, with consultation response to this, with the budget submission, trying to work behind the scenes as well as publicly with government and with officials to try and influence what should be in that strategy, where the funding needs to be found. All departments are going to be vying for more funding in the upcoming spending review. So the more evidence we can give to help the new ministerial team and the officials from a housing and planning perspective to make the case for why more funding and is needed, as well as supporting the bill, helping to shape it to be the framework that we need it to be. There's an opportunity for us, I suppose, is what I'm saying. So there's lots to do, but hopefully opportunity to try and make things better and make the case for more funding and more certainty. So do please keep talking to us. It's great to have all your feedback today. And I know Megan and the team are really keen to hear whether it's high level points or points of detail. And then we will, as always, share our response on the CIH website as well. So you'll be able to see what we put through.
Thank you very, very much, Rachel. And thank you, Megan, for all of your input and everything today. It's been absolutely valuable and a really, really powerful session, one that I think a lot of people are going to want to watch back. Next week, we are welcoming Sadie Jones from She Beast to the Social Housing Roundtable to start talking around domestic violence and community project work that she's doing. So a bit of a different narrative, but looking forward to that. But for now, a massive thank you to Rachel, a massive thank you to Megan, and a massive thank you to everybody who contributed and shared thoughts and shared ideas. As I say, that email address is policyandpractice@cih.org. Do reach out. We've only got a month. So if you have got thoughts, please share them because they need to be shared. But for now, thank you, everybody. And I look forward to seeing you all at a future event. Cheers.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt. Bye, everyone.